The car sat alone on the side of the road in Mojave County, Arizona. Not crashed. Not abandoned. Just stopped. Inside the driver's seat was a man who looked calm, too calm. His hands rested on the steering wheel as if he were waiting for instructions, not answers. And in the back seat, covered and motionless, was Allison Gregory. By the time deputies reached the vehicle, the timeline had already begun to unravel. Hours earlier, Allison had been expected at the airport. She never arrived. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages went unread. Somewhere between routine plans and sudden silence, something had gone terribly wrong. Now, miles from home, the truth was sitting in plain sight, locked inside a vehicle that should never have left Surprise, Arizona. Investigators didn't yet know what had happened inside the house. They didn't know when the violence started. They didn't know how long Allison had been gone. What they did know was this: she hadn't disappeared. She had been moved. And the man sitting in the front seat was the last person known to be with her. As deputies secured the scene and began asking questions, one haunting reality set in. Every minute that passed before Allison was reported missing had given someone time. Time to act. Time to clean. Time to leave. And whatever happened before that car started moving was already over. Stories like this disappear fast, unless someone chooses to remember them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. Before Allison Gregory became a name spoken in courtrooms and headlines, she was a presence, steady, disciplined, and quietly resilient. She was 41 years old, a Navy veteran, a mother to 14-year-old and 20-year-old daughters. Allison had lived a life shaped by service long before anyone ever associated her name with tragedy. Her years in the U.S. Navy taught her structure, accountability, and endurance. Those who knew her said she carried herself with a calm confidence, the kind that comes from having faced pressure and learned how to stand firm without raising her voice. After her military service, Allison focused on building a life rooted in stability. She worked hard, planned carefully, and thought constantly about the future, not just for herself, but for her daughters. Everything she did revolved around them. School schedules, routines, small moments that mattered more than grand gestures. To her children, she wasn't a hero in uniform. She was Mom, the one who showed up, the one who kept promises, the one who made sure they felt safe. If Allison's story matters to you, staying here is one small way to make sure her life isn't reduced to a headline. Subscribe to this channel. Allison loved structure, but she also loved simple comfort. She found peace in everyday routines, walking her pets, keeping her space organized, spending quiet evenings at home. Animals were part of her world, a source of calm and companionship. Friends noticed how she softened around them, how the tension she carried seemed to ease in those moments. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She thought things through. That was especially true when it came to love. Allison had married Brandon Gregory years earlier, believing, like so many do, that partnership meant support, trust, and shared growth. At the beginning, there were plans, a future imagined together, a belief that the life they were building would hold. But over time, that belief began to erode. By the final months of her life, Allison was no longer dreaming about what the marriage could be. She was focused on what came next. She was preparing to leave, preparing to start over, preparing to reclaim peace for herself and her daughters. Those closest to her said she had been quietly making plans, sorting through logistics, thinking ahead. She wasn't running, she was transitioning, carefully, methodically, the way she did everything. There was determination in her voice during those conversations, resolve, but also caution. Because Allison understood something many don't until it's too late. Leaving isn't the most dangerous part of a relationship. Preparing to leave is. Most victims don't get remembered for who they were, only for how they died. This channel exists to change that. Kindly subscribe. In the days leading up to her disappearance, she had obligations, responsibilities, a family member arriving at the airport, a schedule that required her to be somewhere at a specific time. And she was dependable. When Allison Gregory said she would be somewhere, she showed up. Except this time, she didn't. Her phone went silent. Her routine broke. And the woman who never missed what mattered most was suddenly gone. And as the hours ticked by, one question grew heavier with every passing minute. What happened to Allison Gregory? In the narrow window of time, between planning her future and never arriving to it? Long before Allison Gregory was found dead in the back seat of her car, the pressure inside her life had been quietly building, measured not in arguments but in deadlines, court dates, custody discussions, move-out plans. By the spring of 2025, Allison and Brandon Gregory were no longer simply a married couple going through a rough patch. According to police and court records, they were in the middle of a contentious divorce, one marked by disagreement over custody, control, and what the future would look like once the marriage officially ended. And for Allison, that future was getting close. She had told people she was preparing to leave the home they still shared in Surprise, Arizona. Not abruptly, not emotionally, but deliberately. She was lining things up, housing, schedules, logistics involving her daughters. The kind of planning that suggests someone was serious and almost ready. That mattered, because separation changes the balance of power. In custody disputes, emotions don't stay theoretical. They become transactional. Time with children is measured. Decisions are documented. And every conversation carries consequences. Those close to Allison later described rising tension. Not loud confrontations, but strain. The kind that shows up in guarded conversations and careful wording. The kind that forces someone to watch what they say and when they say it. Police would later confirm that the divorce was not amicable. There were disagreements about parenting. Disagreements about living arrangements. Disagreements about what Allison was allowed to do next. And beneath it all was something harder to quantify: fear. Not panic. Not hysteria, but awareness. Allison knew she was walking a narrow path. She wasn't reckless with her plans. She didn't announce her next move publicly. She didn't rush the exit. She tried to manage the transition quietly, keeping the peace long enough to get out safely. But tension has a way of leaking out. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Allison's routine began to feel heavier. Conversations felt more loaded. Time felt compressed. There were obligations she couldn't ignore, like picking up a family member from the airport. Commitments that anchored her to a timeline whether she wanted them to or not. And timelines are dangerous when someone feels like they're losing control. Investigators would later piece together that the custody battle wasn't just about the children, it was about leverage. About who decided what happened next. About whether Allison's future would move forward or be stopped. She was close. Close to leaving. Close to starting over. And that proximity matters more than most people realize, because statistically, verifiably, the period when someone is preparing to leave a troubled relationship is the most dangerous moment of all. And then came the day she never arrived at the airport. No warning. No goodbye. No delay message. Just silence. And somewhere between the final custody conversations and the moment Allison was expected to show up, something snapped. The first alarm didn't come from police. It came from a mother. On May 14th, Jan McCumbers tried calling her daughter, Allison Gregory. Once. Then again. No answer. That alone was unusual. Allison was reliable, especially when plans involved family. And this plan mattered. Jan had flown in for a reason. She wasn't visiting for a holiday or a casual stay. She was there to help her daughter move out of her husband's home. To help her take the final, physical step away from a marriage that had become untenable. The arrangement was clear. Allison would pick a family member up at the airport. She always kept her word. But as the minutes passed, the phone stayed silent. By the time Jan landed, there was still no sign of Allison. No text. No call explaining a delay. No last-minute change of plans. Just absence. Jan waited. She called again. And again. Still nothing. That's when concern shifted into something heavier. Because Allison wasn't just late, she was unreachable. By later that day, with no contact and no explanation, Jan McCumbers contacted authorities. On May 14th, police were notified that 41-year-old Allison Gregory was missing after failing to show up at the airport to pick up her mother. Officers began doing what they always do in the earliest hours of a missing person case, establishing timelines. When was Allison last seen? Who spoke to her last? What was her state of mind? They learned quickly that Allison hadn't vanished at random. She had plans. She had obligations. She had a reason to be exactly where she said she would be. And she had been preparing for this day. Investigators confirmed that the purpose of Jan's visit was practical and urgent, helping Allison move out. Boxes. Logistics. Transition. A mother coming not just to support emotionally, but to make sure the move actually happened. That detail mattered, because it placed Allison on a clock. If you're still listening right now, it's because you understand why these stories deserve to be told all the way through. Subscribe. Police began tracing her last known movements. They checked phone activity. They reviewed when her device last pinged. They confirmed that after a certain point, Allison's digital trail went cold. No outgoing calls. No responses. No activity consistent with someone simply running late. Officers expanded the search. They looked at the home in Surprise, Arizona. They spoke with people close to Allison. They learned about the divorce, about the custody tensions, about the fact that Allison was on the verge of leaving. And then, another development quietly escalated the case. Allison's vehicle was missing. That shifted the investigation outward. Beyond Surprise, beyond the airport, beyond the assumption that she might still be nearby. As the hours stretched on, police began coordinating across jurisdictions. If Allison had left voluntarily, something should have shown up. Credit card use, phone movement, sightings. There was nothing. And then came the break. Allison's vehicle was located. Not in Surprise, not near the airport, but in Mojave County, Arizona, 100 miles away from where she was supposed to be. When deputies approached the car, they weren't yet treating it as a homicide. At that point, it was still a missing person case, tense, urgent, unresolved. But something about the scene felt wrong. The timeline no longer made sense. The distance didn't fit the plan. And Allison still hadn't contacted anyone. As officers prepared to look closer, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever had stopped Allison from picking up her mother, had also stopped her from ever coming back. And the truth, the real truth, was sitting just out of sight. By the time investigators pieced together the final hours of Allison Gregory's life, the question was no longer if she had been killed. It was how and why. And now, the perpetrator had a name. Brandon Gregory. Once in custody, Brandon did not deny that Allison was dead. Instead, he offered an explanation, one that investigators would later dissect not for emotion, but for behavioral truth. He claimed the violence began during a heated argument inside the home. According to his statement, Allison allegedly kicked him in the groin. He said she initially had the baseball bat in her hand. He framed the moment as chaotic, reactive, sudden. But behavioral evidence tells a different story. Because what matters in homicide investigations is not just what someone says happened, but what they did after. Crime scene photographs revealed patterns that went far beyond what would be necessary to stop a perceived threat. The injuries were not consistent with a single defensive act. The force used was excessive, repetitive, sustained. This wasn't a moment that spiraled out of control. It was a moment that continued long after control was no longer needed. That matters. In behavioral analysis, excessive force often signals more than fear. It signals rage, possession, or punishment, especially when the victim is already incapacitated. And then there's what came next. After Allison was beaten, Brandon didn't call for help. He didn't seek medical assistance. He didn't report an accident or self-defense. Instead, he made decisions, deliberate ones. He moved her body. He placed her in the back seat of her vehicle. He left the home. That act alone shifts the crime from impulsive violence to conscious awareness. Because concealment is not reflex, it's intent. Behavioral experts often refer to this as post-offense behavior, and it speaks volumes. Transporting a body requires time, physical effort, and emotional compartmentalization. It means the perpetrator has crossed a line internally, from reaction to strategy. And the location matters too. Allison wasn't left where she fell. She wasn't abandoned at the scene. She was taken miles away. Distance is not random. It reflects a desire to delay discovery, to create confusion, to buy time. These are not the actions of someone acting in fear for their life. They are the actions of someone trying to control the narrative. When deputies found Brandon with Allison's body in Mojave County, the scene itself told a story. Not of panic, but of resignation. Of someone who had already made his choices and now stood inside the consequences of them. The explanation he gave, about the argument, the kick, the bat, was weighed against physical evidence, injury patterns, and timelines. And it didn't hold. Because self-defense ends when the threat ends. This violence did not. But even as the truth began to crystallize, one question still lingered, one investigators hadn't fully answered yet. What happened in the hours between the killing and the moment Brandon Gregory was found in that car? Because somewhere in that gap, another decision was made. And it would matter just as much as the first. The arrest did not come with flashing lights or a dramatic chase. It came quietly. On a stretch of road in Mojave County, Arizona, deputies located the vehicle after a welfare alert escalated into something far more serious. Inside the car sat Brandon Gregory. In the back seat was Allison. By then, there was no confusion about what had happened. Brandon was taken into custody without resistance. Officers later noted his demeanor, calm, cooperative, almost subdued. Not frantic, not panicked. A detail that would later surface in court as behavioral context, not coincidence. During the search incident to arrest, investigators recovered personal items, including documents and handwritten material. Among them was something that immediately caught their attention. A letter, written in Brandon's own hand, addressed to his daughters. It was not a confession, but it wasn't neutral either. The tone was apologetic, emotional, and final. He wrote about love, about regret, about how much he wished things were different. What the letter did not contain was just as telling. No clear denial, no mention of self-defense, no assertion of innocence. In legal terms, it became part of the circumstantial evidence. Not proof of guilt on its own, but a window into mindset. Prosecutors would later argue that the letter demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing. Defense attorneys pushed back, framing it as emotional distress following a tragic accident. The court would decide which interpretation carried weight. As Brandon was formally booked, investigators began assembling the timeline that would define the trial. Autopsy result, injury analysis, vehicle data, phone records, statements from family members who described escalating tension in the months leading up to Allison's death. And then came a detail that hadn't been public at first. Digital evidence showed activity after Allison's death. Small but significant actions that suggested awareness, not shock. Movements, delays, gaps where help could have been called, but wasn't. Each piece alone was subtle. Together, they formed a pattern. When Brandon Gregory was charged with second-degree murder, the courtroom filled quickly. Media outlets focused on the brutality of the crime. But inside the legal filings, the case was being framed around something more precise. Behavior before, during, and after the act. Not emotion. Not speculation. behavior. And as opening arguments approached, both sides knew the trial would hinge on a single question. Was this a moment of uncontrolled rage, or a sequence of deliberate choices? Because the jury hadn't yet heard the most damaging evidence, and when they did, it would force them to decide not just what Brandon Gregory did, but who he was in the moments that followed. By the time prosecutors laid out the physical evidence, the story hardened into something undeniable. They told the court that Allison Gregory was struck multiple times with a baseball bat, not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The injuries, they argued, were not consistent with a single impulsive blow. The pattern spoke of sustained force, delivered after any immediate threat would have passed. Investigators testified about what was recovered in Brandon Gregory's possession when he was located in Mojave County. Among the items were Allison's phone and her smartwatch, devices that should have been on her body, recording her movement, her pulse, her final moment. Instead, they were separated from her, silent, carried away from the scene. To prosecutors, that separation mattered. It suggested interruption, control, and action taken after the violence stopped. Then the case shifted from blood evidence to paper. Jurors learned that Allison and Brandon had already agreed to sell their home in Surprise, Arizona, a sale that prosecutors said was scheduled to close on May 19, just days after Allison was killed. The paperwork had been filled months earlier, back in January, during what family members described as a tense and fragile period of separation. Those documents revealed more than a real estate transaction. They showed the future Allison was preparing for. Under the agreement, Allison was to receive 100% custody of her 14-year-old daughter, with Brandon Gregory ordered to pay child support. Prosecutors framed this not as background noise, but as motive pressure, an approaching deadline that would finalize loss of control, loss of access, and loss of the shared home. Everything was already set in motion. And then came the court's response. Brandon Gregory was ordered held on a high bond, reflecting the severity of the charges and the court's assessment of risk. Prosecutors made clear they were seeking a lengthy prison sentence under Arizona law, decades, not years, arguing the facts supported a conviction that would keep him incarcerated for most, if not all, of his remaining life. As of the latest public court proceedings, sentencing had not yet been finalized. The trial phase was still unfolding, with prosecutors building toward a punishment they described as proportionate to the violence and its aftermath. But even before a jury reached its final decision, one truth had already settled into the room. Allison Gregory had been planning her exit. Her independence was days away from becoming permanent, and the closer that future came into focus, the more the past seemed to tighten its grip. Because the trial wasn't finished yet, and the most haunting questions still lingered, not about what happened in that house, but whether anyone could have stopped it before the paperwork turned into a death sentence. In the days that followed Allison Gregory's death, the silence she left behind was filled by voices trying to carry what she no longer could. A GoFundMe was created for Allison's daughters. 2 young lives suddenly forced to grow up without the one person who anchored them. The page wasn't filled with statistics or legal language. It was filled with memories. Small, human details. The kind that make a loss feel unbearable because they make it real. Allison loved dogs. Not casually, deeply. Neighbors remembered seeing her often, leash in hand, moving at an easy pace, always present, always kind. James Sullivan, who lived nearby, later described her as very nice, the kind of person who never passed without a greeting, a wave, a smile, a simple hello as she walked her dogs past his house. Those moments mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Allison wasn't just a name in a police report. She was a U.S. Navy veteran, someone who had served her country before returning home to build a quieter life rooted in care and connection. Friends and family described her as joyful and passionate, someone who found peace outdoors and comfort in cooking for the people she loved. The kitchen was one of her happy places. Cooking wasn't just a task, It was how she showed love. How she made a house feel like home. She was also a devoted mother. Everything she planned, everything she endured, was shaped by the future she wanted for her children. She believed in stability, in safety, in starting over, even when starting over felt terrifying. And she was doing it. Allison was preparing to move out, preparing to reclaim her life, preparing for a future that was finally her own. Her achievements didn't make headlines, but they mattered. Service, motherhood, resilience, the courage to leave something that was no longer safe. Those are victories that rarely get celebrated, until they're taken away. And that's the hardest part of this story. Not just that Allison Gregory died, but that she was on her way to living. Some true crime stories end with answers. This one ends with an absence. An empty driveway where a car should have pulled in. A phone that stopped ringing. Dogs that waited by the door. Daughters who will grow up with memories instead of moments. Allison Gregory was more than a victim. She was a veteran. A mother. A neighbor who waved. A woman who loved deeply and believed that tomorrow could be better than today. Her story forces us to sit with an uncomfortable truth. That leaving can be the most dangerous moment of all. If this story stayed with you, if Allison's life felt close, familiar, painfully real, then stay with this channel. Because behind every headline is a human being. Behind every case is a life that mattered. And telling their stories is one way we make sure they're never forgotten. If you made it to the end of Allison Gregory's story, then you already know, looking away is easy. Staying isn't. Subscribing doesn't bring her back. But it keeps her from being forgotten. And for victims like Allison, being remembered is the last thing we can still give.